Okay, good morning, everyone, and I will call the regular meeting of the Board of the Regional Transportation Authority to order. And if you could, Madam Secretary, let's call the roll.
Could we call a pledge?
Sure. You going to do that first? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I just wanted to know, Audrey, who wasn't here for the pledge. So. Now you can call the roll.
You're going to mess up my order.
Yeah. Colin Kaepernick's not a member of the board here.
How about we do a roll call?
That'd be great. Let's take a roll.
Director Anderson, Director Buchanan, Director Colson, Director DeWitt, Director Durante, Director Fraga, Director Fuentes,
Here.
Director Higgins,
Here.
Director Hobson,
Here.
Director Lewis,
Here.
Director McAllis, Director Melvin,
Here.
Director Pang,
Here.
Director Ross, Director Traiani,
Here.
Chairman Dillard.
Here.
We have a quorum of 13 present with 3 absent.
Thank you. Before we begin, it was a tough month last month for a couple of families and all of us. And I particularly want to give our condolences and our prayers to Sarah Pang, who lost her father last month. Always difficult. Your dad, in the materials that I read, was an amazing gentleman, a World War II vet, respected pediatric dentist in Rockford, and his story is just amazing, Sarah. And our condolences to the loss of your dad, who just had a remarkable life. So you're a very lucky young lady to have a father like that. You're welcome. Make us proud. And then Al Jordan. A number of us attended the funeral of a respected leader out in McHenry County, as Blake will tell you. Al was a member of this board, somebody who was very much attuned to a lot of governmental needs, but transit was always big on Director Jordan's mind, and we will miss him. I know Pat Durante knew Al Jordan well.
One thing Al should be noted for, aside from his exceptional service on the board, was the fact that he changed the dress code for male members of the board to no tie required. So that was Al.
But we will miss Director Jordan. I'm going to send a note to his bride. But Al and Sarah's father are great losses to not only their families but to the region and to Illinois, and we want to clearly remember them in our thoughts and prayers. So thank you. All right, moving on to regular business. Item 3A is the approval of the minutes from the board meeting held on February 16th, 2017. Are there any questions or comments or addition to those? If not, can I have a motion and a second to approve? Director Ross moves we approve them, seconded by Director DeWitt. Audrey, why don't you call the roll so we have a baseline roll call, please?
All righty. Director Colson. Yes. Director DeWitt. Yes. Director Durante.
Yes.
Director Fraga. Aye. Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Director Higgins.
Aye.
Director Hobson.
Yes.
Director Lewis.
Yes.
Director Melvin.
Yes.
Director Pang. Yes. Director Ross. Yes. Director Traiani.
Aye.
Chairman Dillard.
Yes.
13 ayes and 3 absent.
Thank you, and it will be approved and so reported. The public comment section for today, we have no scheduled speaker for today, so we'll move right on to item 5, which is Executive Director Leanne Redden's report. Leanne?
Good morning. I will be brief because I don't have a huge amount to report on, but as I do, begin where we always begin. The state first quarter of this year owes us just shy of $400 million already. The cost of the short-term borrowing in 2017 so far is already $419,620 but we still have $100 million worth of short-term borrowing capacity available to us to help us float our needs through these delays. In Springfield, budget negotiations, I guess the best way to describe it is stalled. Any momentum that I think some of us maybe hoped for or saw out of the Senate seems to have waned. The budget package that they were talking about did include a series of 14 reform and revenue bills, but disagreement between the governor's office and Senate Democrats seemed to kill the progress, or at least slow things down significantly. As a reminder, though, while the Department of Transportation continues to operate under an approved budget through June 2017, much of the state operations are proceeding without an approved budget, as the temporary budget that they were operating under expired at the end of December. One thing to note, we do have some Jeremy's spending time in Springfield, lucky for him. But the RTA does have a short-term borrowing legislation bill that has been assigned to the House Mass Transit Committee. We anticipate that bill getting a hearing in the next couple of weeks. That ties to the first slide as to reauthorize us to allow us to continue to borrow short-term debt to manage through these budget crises and delays. Washington, most of the attention is being sucked up by healthcare reform. So there's not a lot happening on the transportation side. February 28th, the President did address a joint session of Congress and reiterated his plans for $1 trillion investment into the U.S.'s infrastructure. He spoke very broadly about replacing roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, and railroads, but didn't really, and talked a lot about public-private financing, but did not really provide any details, though. On March 2nd, the White House convened a meeting with representatives from at least 15 different agencies to discuss his infrastructure proposal. The group is being led by the National Economic Council Director, Gary Cohn, and will focus on identifying critical infrastructure projects, both existing and new, that will help the economy. Industry stakeholders continue to pressure the White House, us included. Jeremy, myself, and the chairman got back from Washington on Tuesday night and continuing to make a push while we're happy to hear that there's an interest in investing in infrastructure. It cannot be just all private equity money and or one-time tax credits or other, what's the word I'm looking for, getting the money back. It needs to actually incorporate some revenue sources as well. So that's something that we continue as an industry and just ourselves to push. The RTA is also changing topics slightly. We're looking to invite local governments, private not-profit organizations, and transportation providers to apply for federal dollars under the category 5310 monies. Through an open competitive process initiated by the RTA. We estimate that approximately $8.4 million in federal funds will be available to award through this process. Section 5310 monies are available, the only available source of funding for transit projects that are designed to serve older adults, people with disabilities, that go beyond the requirements of the ADA. No RTA funds get used in this program. We are essentially the administrator of these federal dollars for the region. Applications will be due May 1st. The recommended program of projects will be presented to the board in August this year after we receive those applications. To obtain those applications and for more information on the program, people should visit our website. If you get any interested inquiries or make any outreach amongst people you work with, please refer to the website or let us know and we can sort of follow up. As a designated recipient, the RTA is responsible for overseeing this program for Northeastern Illinois and developing what we call the annual program of projects. These funds will be dedicated to expanding mobility options and removing barriers to transportation services for seniors and people with disabilities. Currently, we have 14 ongoing projects that are being funded out of that pot of money as well. And as we already talked about, tomorrow and Saturday, we are celebrating Transit Employee Appreciation Day. I guess I should put an S on that, days. We do so to honour, as we mentioned, the contributions of the hardworking transit employees at CTA, Metra and PACE, as well as us here at the RTA. This photo was taken last year as part of the celebration. One of our staff members gave a thank you card to their conductor. This is Rock Island conductor John McCarthy, and he agreed to let us take his picture and use it as part of our celebration and promotions. So I handed out cards to you. There's more if you want them. I encourage you to say thank you to anybody you encounter on the transit system, that we thank them for the hard work that they do. You can also, if you're willing, take a picture or a selfie with your conductor or transit employee and share that with us, and we'll be happy to post those on social media. You could also do it using the hashtag #LoveTransit. And there's more, as I said, there's more cards available. With that, that ends my report. I would be happy to entertain any other questions you might have.
Any questions or suggestions, comments? Okay. If not, we will move on to item 6, and that's the approval of the consent items as they appear on the board agenda. 6A is the ordinance authorizing the execution of the federal funding allocation between Northwest Indiana and Southeastern Wisconsin, and amending the capital program and ICE-funded projects. 6B is the ordinance approving the RTA travel and expense policy, and those are the two. Any questions, further questions on those? If not, can I have a motion to approve the consent items as they appear on 6? Director Friga moves that we approve those, seconded by Director Patrick Durrani. Is there leave for the attendance roll call? Seeing no objection, Audrey, it's a 13-0 vote on the...
No, 13 yes and 3 absent.
3 absent. Great, thank you. Item 7 is new business. Any new business to come before the board? Nadine, did you want to say something on I saw your quizzical look on...
Sure. We're talking about going into executive session, right? Pursuant to subsections 2C21 and 2C11 of the Open Meetings Act, if the board would vote to go into executive session, we could then proceed with that portion of the meeting and then return from executive session for the strategic plan workshop.
Great. So there's no new business for today, and I do want to remind the board that our next meeting is Thursday, April 20th, starting with committees at 8:30, and our normal procedure is to have the regular board meeting immediately after. For this executive session, we are going to come back after executive session for a couple of more agenda items. So let's go quickly to executive session, and then we will be back for a couple more items.
We need a motion and a second.
Is there a motion to go to dissolve ourselves into executive session? Moved by Director Fuentes, seconded by Director Christopher Melvin, that we go into executive session. Is there leave for the attendance roll call on that? And we'll be back for further action. Thank you.
You're here, that's good news. Good news for us.
I'm fast. They did call me the Flash back in high school.
Make sure they
Just kidding.
Their cards? I think that they should stay in their seats, and I will sit in the seat. I think that Leanne and Jill should stay in their seats.
Yeah.
I'll sit in the seat.
I can sit over on the end, so it's not distracting. I'll sit over on the end, so it's not distracting.
I don't think you'll be distracted. You should sit. Yeah, sit with the rest of us.
Apparently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. You
So,
made it.
Chairman, if you want to, are we good with moving on to item, just reporting out after item 9? Allison?
Yeah. Okay.
So we are back, all board members are still in, so that's good. Okay, reconvening at 10:25.
Thank you. I will call and reconvene the Board of Directors of the Regional Transportation Authority, and we will report out, Allison, if you want to, coming out of executive session on the docket review or whatever we need to cover here.
Okay, thanks, Chairman.
It's item 9A.
Pursuant to the Open Meetings Act, Sections 2C21 and 2.06 C and D, the board has met in executive session to review the closed meeting minutes. In accordance with the Open Meetings Act, public bodies are required to review prior closed meeting minutes periodically to determine whether a need for confidentiality exists with respect to all or part of the minutes. Based on our review, it's our understanding the board reached consensus that we are not releasing any minutes at this time. The approval of the minutes from the executive session meeting authorizes, oh, I apologize. That's all. Thanks. That's all for now.
All right, so do we need a roll call on approving these docket? So
Because we're not releasing anything, we're not actually formally
Okay.
taking any action, so we just needed to just report out that, and then there's no actual action by the board at this point.
Great, thank you. So with that, let's move on to item 10, which is a strategic plan workshop for the board led by Leanne and the staff. Thank you.
Jill and the planning staff are going to, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a second to you again, are going to run through a kind of an organized discussion here. I encourage you to sort of share us your thoughts. We will be interactive. I think it'll keep moving, and as I think all of you know, we have to do a strategic plan every 5 years. Jill's going to get into that. So the update would be due. We anticipate having the board actually approve that in early next year. So it's essentially a year-long process that we will go through, and Jill will touch a little bit more on that. So with that, I'll just turn it over to her and keep this moving.
Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, good morning again. So I just want to introduce members of our strategic planning team, Will Gillespie, Peter Fahrenwald, Heather Tabbert, myself, and Jessica Hector Sue. So we're going to kind of tag team this presentation. So hopefully everybody, as Leanne said, this will be interactive. Did anybody have any issues pulling up the website? We'll get into. That's exactly.
That's what it's supposed to say.
Great. So how this will work, we will present some data, have some discussions, and ask your input on informal polls that will give us live anonymous feedback on policy topics. So We'll go through this. We'll have a little data points. We'll have questions, and then we'll open up after each question for discussion and kind of go through that. If your phone happens to go to sleep throughout the presentation, all you need to do is hit refresh, and it should come back up. So with that, let's dive into this. The 2008 RTA Act specified that RTA would create and adopt a strategic plan every 5 years. This is a regional transit strategic plan that covers the work of the RTA and the service boards. A strategic plan does more than fulfill legislation. It provides us with an opportunity to identify our priorities and strategies for the next 5 years. We are also coordinating with CMAP on development of the On2 2050, the next regional comprehensive plan, as this is a once in a 20-year opportunity when both of our plans are up for renewal in the same year. This brief timeline of the process that we are going through is shown here. The current plan was adopted in 2013, so it's due to be replaced in 2018. We spent 2016 conducting research and completing several foundational studies to help inform the plan. In 2017, we will be directly engaging key stakeholders, collaborating on CMAP's extensive outreach process, and requesting public feedback on the draft plan through hearings coordinated with our budget hearings this fall. We will bring the final plan to the RTA board for your consideration and approval in early 2018. The discussion we will be having today is organized in 9 key headlines that summarize the state of the region and the transit system today based on our research. We will walk through each one, provide some information, and then ask a few questions to get your feedback on the direction we should take to address each headline. So let's start with headline 1. The Chicago region is built on transit. The transit system in our region is the second largest in the nation based on passenger miles traveled, a measure of the number of people we carry and the distance we carry them. Many of the rail lines and many of the bus lines that we have today have existed for decades, and during the first half of the 20th century, Chicago and many suburban towns grew up around the rail system. After World War II, people and companies moved to the suburbs outside of transit-served areas. However, the region is still built up around the transit system, as you can see in this map of population density in 2014. Density is important for us to look at because more people in smaller land areas around stops and stations are needed to support robust, successful transit service. The highest density parts of the region, shown here in dark purple, are in Chicago, where there are more trains and bus lines. Densities decrease as you radiate outward from the city, but areas along the rail lines maintain higher densities in the suburban areas around them. Many people use transit to get to work, and we know from new research our staff did this year that the transit system provides an average household with access to 825,000 jobs within 90 minutes. In this map, we see that the access varies across the region. The darker purple areas have access via transit to more jobs in 90 minutes. The lighter purple areas have access to fewer jobs in that time frame. This map and the other research we'll show you today help us think about what we want our transit system to accomplish. Our current strategic plan, developed in 2013, casts a vision for a world-class public transportation system providing a foundation to the region's prosperity, livability, and vitality. We know from what we just discussed that our transit system is a large and used over 2 million times each day. We know that it shaped the region's built environment, has suffered from sprawl in the past, and is impacted by changes in demographic and mobility yet to come. So it's a good time to rethink our vision. So we're to our first question here, so grab your devices. So thinking about our current vision, what key words best capture your vision for the region's transit system? Is it a world-class system that rivals international peers? A resilient system supporting the region's prosperity, livability, and vitality? A modern system that is the first choice for travel as part of a bigger mobility ecosystem? Or an affordable system that is a cost-efficient alternative to driving? So which of those resonates most with you? You'll just select that and then hit the vote button underneath there. Yeah, you do only get one choice. This is a warm-up. All right, looks like all the votes are cast there. So the leader was the affordable, followed pretty closely by modern, and then world class. No votes or no opinions yet for the resilient. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
On one of the previous slides, you showed a 90-minute commute window. Is a 90-minute commute window really the bar that we're using? Does a 90-minute commute define what a reasonable commute to work should really look like?
So yeah, for that, so we analyzed that in 30, 60, and 90 minutes. We showed the 90 because it has the largest, you can get the furthest, obviously, in 90 minutes. So we use that threshold just because we do have a very large region, and by transit, that's what we chose. But we do have the statistics for 30 and 60 minutes as well.
It's not our goal. I mean, obviously, we're not trying to strive for an hour-and-a-half commute, kind of. Yeah, that would be door to door.
Door to door.
Like your residence, because it comes from census data. So.
Okay. Any other discussion on this? Yes.
I mean, I think it's unfortunate that you can't do some combos here in the answer, because when I think of a world-class system, I think of an affordable system.
Yep. Okay.
Right? So.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point.
And
Yeah.
I think of world-class as all of the below: resilient, modern, affordable. And affordable, I think our systems are affordable today, and they're not as used as heavily as we think they should be. So there's something else missing. To Director Higgins' comments earlier today, it could be, going up against the shared ride programs that are so modern, right at your fingertips, so accessible. So there's something more going on than just affordability. Certainly more affordable than owning a car.
And remember, the CTA hasn't had a fare increase in 8 years.
Okay. Good comments.
I'd like to say something about that, though. I think the CTA is to be commended for that. I don't know if anybody saw the report that came out recently. The Metropolitan Planning Group talked about the real cost of commuting. When you read those stories and you read the statistics, I mean, CTA is serving a lot of communities where people are really, have to take, 2 buses and a train to get to work. So they're to be commended for keeping the rates low and finding innovative ways to raise money. So I think that's, I think it's just important to speak about that and to recognize that.
Yep, that's a good point. We're going to dig more into that a bit later in this presentation.
Absolutely. And the mayor uses it, Chris, he uses it as a bragging thing.
All good. Anything else?
Is there any comment or consideration, Jill, for the subsidy? We don't talk much about the fact that our system is subsidized, but I don't know how subsidized our system is vis-a-vis other systems. That is to say, the support that we receive from non-fare box collection. So I guess when I think about affordable and think about some of Chris's comments about the affordability, I also think about the subsidy. And I know we talk a lot about the lack of subsidies because there's needs, but I just don't know how it measures up vis-a-vis other systems.
Yeah, good point. And later in this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about funding, and I think that will come up as well. But very good point. Okay, so let's move on to our second question. So how much should we invest to pursue that vision? So this is not a question so much about money as a question about the level of commitment. What would you be willing to put behind your vision to make this happen? So your response choices are less investment than today because you don't think transit is the highest priority given the other needs that exist today. Same as is available today because you think we should focus on doing the most with what we already have. A modest increase in investment over today because you think a bit of a lift could go a long way in terms of improving transit, or whatever funding it takes to get there because you think the future of the transit system is worth investing in. All right. 9 votes in, so looks, the largest answer is a modest increase over today, and followed half by that, whatever funding it takes to get there. So yeah, I think the level of investment, I think from those responses, we need to up the level of investment than what we're doing today. Does anybody have any comments on that? Okay, all right.
I do have one comment. It's hard to uncover how the lack of investment in capital hurts us from gaining new riders.
Yep.
So that's something that, we have to kind of think about. What is that balance and how do we uncover that?
Yep, very good point.
Just one anecdotal comment. Where I ride, the western suburbs, and again, I try to remind my neighbors that Metro's on-time performance is 97%. Today I drove in because I've got to do an event with the mayor on the south side later. It's an hour and a half for me to drive in today, as opposed to my normal 22-minute commute. But perception on delays, much caused by mechanical issues, not always under our control, but older equipment probably means more delays. And my riders, delays they just drive people crazy. That means fewer people are going to get on it. Although I will give you, Leanne and I and Jeremy were in Washington, so when they had their 1.5 to 2 inches of snow on Tuesday, they announced on Monday while the sun was shining that they were going to operate on a weekend schedule on Tuesday because they got 1.5 to 2 inches of snow. And Dorval Carter was out there with us, and he sort of smiled and said, "Can you imagine if when we had snow in Chicago, I said we're going to have less public transportation, not more." So, delays are an issue, though.
Delays and then some of the extensions of the lines and new services, how is that really moving the needle on more riders?
So I think that's a good segue to start talking about investment. So our second headline for today is the region's investment is at risk. And as you know, our operating budget for this year in 2017 is $3 billion. And the same sales tax, or the same RTA Act that we talked about earlier provided a sales tax increase to 1.25% in Cook County and 0.5% in the collar counties that provides much of the sales tax revenue that we have. And that, combined with other sources of public funding and the Service Board's operating revenue, makes up that $3 billion. And then we take that funding and we spend it on CTA services, on Metro services, on PACE services, on ADA paratransit services, and for debt service, that's paying back loans that we have, and a little bit for our own RTA operating budget. And we're pretty frugal. As we talked about earlier, we keep the lowest operating cost per passenger mile at 61 cents. And we're pretty proud of our agencies for keeping their costs low. We talked a lot about that already this morning. You talked a lot about that this morning. And we wanted to ask you today if you think we should continue to focus on that. But before we do that, we couldn't help but notice that the middle of our peer group spends about 81 cents per mile. So that's about 20 cents more than we spend. And we wondered, what would it mean for us to invest more in our operations? What could we get more in terms of services and reliability? And is that something that's worth thinking about? So with that in mind, we wanted to ask you now our third question, which is it important for us to maintain the position of lowest cost per passenger mile? Still have room for some votes. 50-50, yeah, ooh. Therein lies the problem, right? A few more votes still coming in. A couple more people to tip that balance one way or the other. So it looks like most of the votes that we have in are saying that no, that's not important for us, but a lot of people still think it is. So it's something that we'll have to continue talking about. Any thoughts on that? Anybody want to
Well, it depends on what it means, right? So it's, it's important if things are going to remain as they are, but if you're going to offer something really different or you make some big changes, I think there's some flexibility. I think that's kind of what that says. Mm-hmm. One thing I notice when I go to Boston, or even on weekends, my first assumption is to take the T. Mm-hmm. Right? It's just an easier way to get around that town. When I'm in Manhattan during the week, my first move is I'm going downtown to get on the 5 or the 6 train. Right? It's just easier way to do it. There's something about the culture or something that makes you that your first impulse. I don't know that that's true in Chicago.
By
by having, essentially any given year, you're going to have a fixed pool of money coming in. And if your operating costs are higher, that means you have less money for capital. And myself, we are always crying for more capital dollars. So by maintaining a low operating cost, that frees up more funds for capital expenditures. So that's why I'm in favor of a low operating cost. And coming from a manufacturer myself, low operating costs also makes you the most competitive and the most agile in the marketplace as well.
Any other thoughts? All right, well then we'll move on to talking about capital now. So our capital budget for the next 5 years is about $5 billion. And the RTA Act that raised our sales tax was supposed to be followed by a state bond program, and it really never came to fruition. So at this point, as again you talked about earlier, we actually have no state funds in our capital budget at all. It's primarily federally funded, funded through bond proceeds, which we need to pay back, and a little bit of created funding from the new transit TIF. That funding is spent on will be spent in the next 5 years on rail line modernization and improvements. That's CTA's Red Purple Modernization Project and Your New Blue primarily. Rolling stock for all three of the agencies, that's new trains, new buses, and debt service. We, about 31% of our assets are not in a state of good repair right now, and at that level of funding that we just talked about, averaged annually, that will be up to 37% in 2035. So things are going to keep getting older at the level of investment that we have right now. We're about fourth in the nation in terms of capital funding. This is shown for 2014, so this is a little bit older than the data you saw earlier. But I like to look at this map because you look at someone like LA, and in 2005 they spent less than us. And they passed their Measure R legislation in 2009 that caused them to now surpass us. And this doesn't even include Measure M, which they passed in the fall and will give them even more funding. Atlanta is another example of a city that passed funding last fall. And all told, something like 33 of the 40-some ballot measures that were taken to voters last fall passed. And so we're seeing small, medium, and large regions around the world, or around the country, decide to invest in their transit systems. So with that, we wanted to ask you, what sources of funding should we pursue in order to increase capital funding to the level of peers? There are a few different things we could look to. We could look to vehicle user fees. This is a gas tax or VMT, vehicle miles travel tax, that we talked about earlier. The gas tax hasn't been raised since the 90s, either at the state level or at the federal level, and has lost much of its buying power. That's a very large source of funding for us. Sales tax extending to services is also a very large source of potential funding for us, and this has been part of the budget discussions in Springfield that are going on even as we speak. Instead, we could look to smaller sources of tax. This would be rental car tax, which is within our authority to levy, or something like parking fees, which has a nice tie-in to transit ridership because it encourages people to actually pay more or ride transit. We could look to something more creative like value capture, continuing to have more TIF legislation and see the city and others decide to use that as a way to match federal funds or pay for projects. Or we could accept that we are behind peers and that we should live within our means, recognizing that some of what will be operating is old.
As a qualifier, perhaps, how many of these would we have direct control over having an effect on either legislatively or otherwise?
So the only one that we have, the board has authority to do right now is the car rental tax. Others would have to be enabled through other governing bodies, either the legislature and or some version of local government potentially too. But any of them also comes with a large sort of campaign effort would have to go with sort of buying a broader support necessarily for some of those too. So with all those caveats in there, I mean, we're just trying to get some sense from you on thoughts.
But we've been depending on Springfield, and that's going so well that you're almost to a point where we're going to be forced to have to deal with taking control of our own destiny here by finding direct methods of generating revenue, not only for RTA, but...
Yeah, so the car rental tax is on the books. It's something we could levy, but, value capture and sort of the TIF legislation, we just saw the city of Chicago pass, and they needed some support from Springfield, but they went ahead and passed, TIF to sort of be creative and generate essentially some local monies that can be used to leverage and match federal dollars, which is how they got their full funding grant agreement out of the feds, and then they hope to also leverage some TIFIA financing out of the feds too.
And a source that's not on here is the Metro approach, where they're raising fares and setting aside some of their fares for capital dollars. I mean, I applaud their approach, but that's certainly not an option that's available to us here.
It's not an option here because, well, as we know, that typically fare revenue, we try to keep that onto the operating side. Metro is carving a piece out, but it's a small piece. And I think we were trying to sort of talk to you about what are the more traditional sources, that are not more traditional, but some of the ones that are more normally tied to capital and have a potential to sort of move the needle.
Well,
You'd have to do huge fare increases to really get.
Well, but maybe it's a combination of multiple things.
Absolutely.
Where that's a piece of it. And, back to Director DeWitt's point, we have to become more self-sufficient because we can't count on the state to bail us out. And maybe it's a smorgasbord, if you will, of a little bit of fare and a little bit of parking fees, a little bit of rental car, and we go that way.
And I think that's kind of what this response sort of shows us, that there's not one, everyone's not leaning towards one thing, and there's a bit of, probably we need to think about a collection, a buffet.
Register a vote for fair increase.
How did we get 15 votes? Or could they vote for one?
Noted. So we have
Did everyone vote for 2? You can vote for 2.
Yes. If you didn't, sorry, you can't go back. I left that part
Oh,
out.
you can't go back.
But point taken. So it looks.
We know. Duly noted. What did we say, it was like 7? I think we, and quick, back of the envelope was about 7 million a year, so it's not a huge amount, but the thought being you could use that to leverage and potentially use it as a revenue stream for, accessing, say, a TIFIA loan or something like that, a federally backed low-interest loan, those kinds of things. So again, it's not going to be a panacea, but it is something that's on the books now that could be done.
So that's a good segue, actually, to our next question, which is about how to leverage that funding, however much we have, which is what is the appropriate use of bonding and other borrowing?
Let's back up and ask a question. So when you look at who rents cars and who parks, and how many people are involved in that, as opposed to a vehicle tax that's much broader, I mean, the differences have to be huge, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Orders of magnitude. Yeah.
Just one other comment. TIF is typically very geographically structured to an area that can throw off a lot of increment, and then it goes to something specific to there. So it would have value in capital that was for a specific point in the system. Yeah, a line, a station, and typically in coordination with a broader development. But
Jessica, before we move on, just a couple of thoughts on those things. Number one is I worry about our ability to be ready to go when the Trump administration has $1 trillion out there, and our ability to match. The mayor was very innovative with his TIF plan, which got us the $1.2 billion extra dollars at the end of the Obama administration. So I worry about our match. On gas taxes, the Wall Street Journal, and they called me a couple of times when I sent in the letter. Our state gas tax, Illinois, in typical fashion, we have 2 gas taxes. We have a sales tax on gas, none of which goes to infrastructure. It goes to the state's general fund, and it's spent however. Our state gas tax was last raised, and it's on a per gallon. So it's not adjusted for inflation, it's per gallon, was last raised 25 years ago in 1991. Its buying power is 60% of what it was in 1961, although construction costs have gone up. The first act of the new governor of Indiana, Mike Pence's lieutenant governor, was to increase Indiana's gas tax. Iowa just increased its gas tax. Nebraska, nice old conservative Nebraska, increased its gas tax. But our gas tax, 19 cents, which goes to infrastructure, even though we're supposed to be the transportation capital of America, is one of the lowest 10 gasoline taxes of any state in America. So I just pointed that out. Sales taxes, and Jeremy and Nadine and Leanne, you read about Governor Rauner and the legislature talking about broadening out the sales tax base. But we've got to really look at that legislation carefully. And broadening out the sales tax base would give us a source of money. But the way I think the grand bargain was put together would not help us. It's defined more as an excise tax, and that broadening out of a sales tax base does not help us. It depends on how it's defined. But in any discussion, as Springfield gets towards a resolution that looks realistic, we've got to make sure that the sales tax base, includes the RTA. That sales tax is our lifeblood. I mean, it's what's kept us alive during these tough times. Ryan, Representative Tom Morrison called me the other day, and I've told Jeremy, go ahead and put a witness slip in favor of it. Representative Morrison has a special bill on the vehicle taxes or vehicle fees. He realizes electric cars don't buy gas, so he has a new user fee on electric cars, and I told Jeremy, slip it. Go ahead. We should be in favor of that because electric cars are running on our roads and they're not paying a gas tax. And so Representative Morrison, a very conservative member of the General Assembly, realizes that electric cars need to be looked at in the 21st century because we didn't know about electric cars or have them out there. But my biggest fear is that we're going to wake up one day and we're not going to have our match ready to go in Michigan and Houston, Texas, and everyone else that are our economic competitors, Indianapolis, Indiana. They're all going to be ready to go, and they're going to be taking Illinois taxpayers' federal dollars and moving them to Michigan and Indiana and other states that want to economically crush us, let alone the fact that Illinois is one of the worst states, other than transportation, in getting our federal tax dollars returned from Washington. So on the rental car tax, two things that I've learned on the rental car tax. Number one is when you try to increase, these rental car companies have a very strong lobby that you just don't know about until you've been out there and had to deal with rental car taxes. But they are really, they have a pretty good lobby. And then I've always thought, and I think I've kind of told the staff that on the rental car tax, that one's sort of our backup just in case of an emergency, and the emergency could be, it could be a downturn in the economy. It could be a lot of things, but it's there. We don't have to have authorization for it. We already have, but I sort of look at the rental car tax as, and it would be really difficult to raise it politically, other than in case of an emergency. And I've just always thought, Director McGallis isn't here, but boy, if we ever had a situation where something happened and we really had to access money, that's our safety valve, sort of like our home equity line of credit.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? All right. Take two on the bonding question then. What is the appropriate use of bonding? So any of those sources of funding, our existing funding as well as any new sources we could use to leverage to bond. But the question is, do we want to do any more than we have today? Do we indeed want to do more, or do we want to really focus that on specific projects and purposes? So it looks like bonding for specific projects and purposes is something that we should think about. Does anybody want to chime in and talk more about that?
My vote was cast on the notion that if total revenues are, it's hard to understand what we would have the ability to repay. So, yes, I'd like to bond more, but I'd like to do it based on the fact that we had a lot more total revenue, you know, to be able to do projects with.
My thought is that we should, I mean, bonding is, it's like fire. Fire is good when you use it to cook food or warm your house, but if it gets out of control, you know, it just burns down everything that you have. So I think that, you know, debt or bonding should be used in a comprehensive, strategic way. But knowing, as JD said, you know, how we're going to be able to repay it, as opposed to kicking the can down the road, which I see all too often where people borrow today because you got debt capacity, but, you know, 5 years down the road, your revenue stream changes and you really can't pay back the debt, and that becomes a big albatross.
Yeah, I just think that the debt belongs at the service boards, and that, you know, they're the ones who are keeping our costs low. They're the ones who have control of the issues. It belongs there. I don't think it's appropriate for us to have a lot of debt at our level as an oversight organization. And if you run into a bad recession, we'll all be fighting for the same pool of dollars, which is not good for them long term. If the rating agencies perceive some danger to their ability to repay their debt, and I think it just gets in the way. So I think that you know, we should help get money downstream to them, and let them take care of their own you know, issuance of debt and manage it themselves, because they've got the resources to do it, and that's where they can make a difference.
Clarify though, maybe I misinterpreted the question, because I assumed that we were talking about the system here, not just our agencies.
Right. Yeah, the question is intentionally broad, I think, for that reason, yeah. Any other thoughts on bonding? Okay, thank you.
What's
Oh,
Metra's history on bonding? So have they bonded before? I mean, I don't think they've ever really gone out into the market.
No, they've never bonded.
That one, when I got here, sitting in this seat, that was a surprise to me.
Aren't they taking a more aggressive approach from a revenue standpoint? I mean, it's one or the other. You either borrow it or you increase your revenue stream. I think something to be said for that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so that brings us to our third headline, which is many people ride transit, but many don't. About 2.2 million trips are made every weekday on the transit system in the region. CTA accounts for about 1.6 million, split evenly between bus and rail. Metro provides nearly 300,000 trips and pace about 100,000 trips. System ridership declined in the 80s, led by a major reduction in CTA bus ridership. That was partly brought on by service cuts as a result of loss of industrial jobs. But since a mid-1990s low, bus ridership on CTA and PACE has been really steady, while Metro and CTA rail ridership have seen steady growth. Transit use is following a positive trend, and that's not just in Chicago, but nationally. However, a small but distinct drop in CTA bus ridership since 2013 is apparent and potentially of concern. CMAP's Go to 2040 plan set a goal to double transit ridership by 2040, but how might we do that? As part of planning for the 2050 plan, CMAP took a closer look at this, asking their transportation model what level of impact different strategies might have on shifting people to use transit, increasing transit's mode share and ridership. What they found is that high-level policies and strategies, shown in green colors, broadly implemented across the region, tend to have significant impact on regional transit mode share. Yet, transit agencies have no direct control over these things. Service changes and capital projects, which are shown in blue, have less of an impact on mode share, but are things that transit agencies can more directly have the ability to influence. So we recognize that mode share or ridership are not the only goal for transit projects, as capital investments can provide economic development and equity of service benefits, among other things. So that brings us to our question. Given these findings and what you think are important impacts of the transit system, what types of strategies should we focus on? So there's pricing, which is pushing for policies like pricing parking, fare strategy, motor fuel taxes, tolls. There are land use policies advocating for plans to bring more jobs into the CBD, more jobs in your rail, or more households in your transit. There are transit service strategies, which is increasing frequency of existing buses or enhancing bus routes. And then there's transit capital projects, which are expanding the rail system, improving stations and vehicles. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive in practice, and in fact, there are co-benefits from these when implemented together. But we are looking for you to choose one so we can have a discussion about it.
Can I ask for a little clarification?
Yeah.
Back to Ryan's point, almost like either I saw you had last mile on there, but
Mhm.
there's nothing about connectivity, trying to either provide more information or more integration, seamless integration between the various options. So which of those four boxes would encompass thinking like that? Because before I vote, I want to make sure I understand which one would capture that. Was the answer none of the above?
The answer might be none of the above. Maybe that's something we should have a discussion about. I think it mostly falls probably into transit service and thinking about how we are doing our operations and integrating things together in a connective way. But something we should probably bring out for more discussion.
In your slide before, you had last mile service,
Yeah.
which really almost kind of touches on that.
Yeah.
But I didn't quite see it in those four categories that you provided for us.
Right, and then the last mile is kind of in a transit service realm, so I think if the way that it was modeled for these purposes anyway. Oh, okay, so
How's the loop link doing? Is that what it's called? I just forgot. Yeah, loop link.
What you're touching on is some of the things that, how do we increase efficiency within the operations of the existing services, and how do we, reduce travel times actually on some of those buses so they're more competitive. The very practical, sort of some of the stuff we're seeing is, the proliferation of the Ubers and Lyfts of the world that are sort of just literally taking up street space, which could actually start to get you into some the land use discussions and sort of controlling that public space. Is that something we should even be sort of participating in to give the advantage to the bus service, for example? There are some of the sort of related policies that you can start thinking about. So.
What Chris talked about kind of has some parallel to the Metra situation. On a Metra train, during the express times, like I take the one in Olympia Field, so it'll stop at, Park Forest and Richmond Park, and the last stop will be Olympia Fields, then it'll express downtown. When I lived in the city, I took the 22 and 36, and to Chris's point, it would stop all the way downtown. And so as the millennials tend to be more time sensitive, so they probably don't want to get on a bus. As Chris says, it's going to take them an hour or so. So if you had like the 22 or 36 and it stopped picking up people at Fullerton and expressed all the way downtown, that might be a way to increase ridership. Just something to think about during the peak hours.
Yeah.
Okay, so now while we didn't get a lot of responses on the pricing part of this, we do have our next question, which is getting more at that and more about advertising. So, what kinds of fairs and marketing initiatives could generate new riders and new revenue? Multitasking here. So, again, here we're focused more on direct ways to get people to ride transit. Keep in mind that, of course, fare discounts are popular, but discounting fares has a cost associated with it that transit agencies must somehow absorb. So we're looking for you to select two answers on this one. So we have regional-wide fare passes. That could be daily or weekly passes where you use the entire system with integrated transfers. Creative fare pricing strategies, which could be variations by time of day. Capping allowances, where if you've spent $10, we won't charge you anymore for the day, that type of thing. Promotional fares, which could be for families, events, or holidays. Modal partnerships. Here we're thinking about integrations with like divvy fare structure, so you could ride both systems under the same type of fare. Improved information in terms of maps, apps, wayfinding on the street. Ad campaigns by service boards or RTA. Ride On is a great example of an RTA ad campaign, or more user education outreach where we actually go out and teach people how to use the system. All right, so I think the votes are largely in here. So we have a three-way split for the top, which is regional-wide fare passes, more modal partnerships. That's interesting to see, and also more of the ad campaigns we've seen. But again, a very good mix of a lot of different ideas. So does anybody want to talk about their answers or why they chose what they did?
As a marketing person, I always think that ad campaigns work best when you have something new to advertise. So that's why I think, really these partnerships and things like that are what really get people interested in tuning in. Because I think a lot of what we want to do is get new people tuning in.
Earlier I spoke about information. I know I just, and Jill was very helpful. I'm sending some information out to a local hospital because they just didn't know about the Ventra app. Actually, and Leanne educated me as well on some of the things that can be done. So the more we get information, marketing, education out to the general populace, the better the chances are. And also information when we talked about some of the scheduling for transportation is coming. If people know more, then they can take advantage of it more.
All right. If there's more comments, I'll pass it on for our next headline.
Actually, I had one more thought I want to contribute to that. So on the modal partnerships, I think that is something worth exploring. I also think it's worth exploring whether we can do it better with Pace Rideshare, for example. So not to the exclusion of using our own existing infrastructure and building out our Pace Rideshare, but if we can't do that as good, then partner with some of the private sector.
Okay, our fourth headline, great transit access serves a strong central business district. The historic growth of the city with a strong radial rail system continues to make the Chicago CBD the predominant employer in the region. Jobs are located throughout the region. This map shows the density of jobs per square mile. The Chicago CBD is by far the strongest and most dense. In a 4 square mile area, density is about 150,000 jobs per square mile. Also of note, For the 5 years between 2009 and 2014, the Chicago CBD saw an increase in jobs of 13.8% versus a 6.2% gain for the region. Here we show the percent of professional jobs that can be accessed from any point in the region. The dark orange area that shows the locations with the best access to professional jobs skews northwest, because from these areas there is strong access to both the Loop and the job concentrations in O'Hare and the Schaumburg corridors. And the density and great access to the Loop results in transit serving 62% of the daily work trips. And a strong transit market means that we would have a major traffic problems without transit, but there are also some segments of the transit system which have capacity concerns. The strong market is a market that we want to protect and continue to grow. So our question is, how do we support major infrastructure projects, such as the Red Purple modernization, Union Station redevelopment, Metro's A2 interlocking, that support this giant and growing market? So we have a long-term sustainable funding that rely on a strong capital program. We work to increase density and more businesses in those growing corridors to sustain ridership and provide potential local funding such as TIFs, or more public-private partnerships to bring in new private funding and perhaps project ownership and maintenance by private entities, although not all projects, of course, may work for a P3 model, or better integration between highway and transit projects, such as we've done with IDOT for Bus on Shoulder and the Forest Park Blue Line Vision Study, or Tollway with I-90 and Enhanced Pace Service, or even with CDOT, street reconstructions that incorporate transit signal priority.
We can take a few more votes.
Okay. So funding and exploring private partnerships, discussion on this?
When Leanne was giving her report today, should let you know, Leanne and I did meet, and they are really not taking meetings. We went to USDOT to see the President Trump's person, who is the special assistant to Secretary Elaine Chao. And I would say, and he gave us plenty of his time, the bulk of his questioning was on, obviously, job creation. You know, he clearly, and Leanne has to report back to him. He wants examples of what transit means to job creation, including, and I give him a lot of credit for thinking about this, and the Brown Line's a great story, where when the Brown Line was redeveloped, 40%, property values went up 40% within a mile of the Brown Line. He was very quick and astute to say, well, that increases your property taxes, which puts money into your public schools and you folks. And he was and I think we're going to see this a lot in the Trump administration. He was a graduate of the University of Chicago and I believe a Harvard MBA. So he's a money guy, not a transit guy, a money guy, an equity guy at USDOT. But he said, you folks in mass transit need to point out that you increase other forms of revenue for governments by your transportation. And you need to show that, you increase other forms, whether it's sales tax, income tax, all the jobs that are created here in the central business district of Chicago, these folks are paying state income tax. And you need to start taking credit for the other revenue sources, coffers that you fill for, for our government entities out there. And he goes, I don't want to tell you how to package your sales pitch, but, clearly let us know. And he zeroed in on Union Station. Well, what kinds of other development do you think will be around there? Are there going to be new construction jobs? Will there be an increase in employment in that area? Those kinds of questions right here. He quizzed us, Director Hobson, on fare box recovery, and clearly wanted to know what's our fare box recovery. I think he was I told them that I believe one of the reasons that the Central Business District in Chicago is doing so well, and again, since no one seems to always want to report good news about Illinois, Chicago has led the nation, according to Site Selection magazine, in the number of corporate relocations in this country the last 3 years. And while the talent, and it's the talent pool, but it takes mass transit to keep that talent pool here and to move them. And I think it's very clear that we've seen that there are companies moving here because they want our millennial workforce, and we know our millennial workforce doesn't own cars, and they take, they take transit. The gentleman at USDOT was, I saw him write it down, that 90% of the people that work at Motorola in the merchandise mart take mass transit to work. So when we're out there making our case for more infrastructure money from Washington, we clearly know that they want data, they want proven data, but there are more people working and living in the central business area of Chicago, and as we've seen, it's an economic growth is twice the rest of the state of Illinois, and mass transit is just a major part of that. And as Susan Massal writes all the time, for every dollar invested in mass transit, there's a $4 return, mostly in private sector money. The before and after pictures of Southport when the Brown Line Avenue or Brown Line was redeveloped, are amazing. So, your stuff is exactly what the White House was really focused on when it's sitting here, looking at the returns. The other major thing that we got drilled into our head hundreds of times, Jeremy, myself, and Leanne, is the American Public Transportation Association now has in all of their materials 87% of everyone who rides mass transit is either going to a job, which means more income taxes and more revenue for them, and governments around here because they pay taxes voluntarily. 87% of everyone on a mass transit route is either going to work or going to spend money. And we're going to focus more in on the retailers because the retailers' workforce takes pace. Those shopping centers in suburban Chicago would be mighty barren if you didn't have pace to bring them their employees. But 87% of everybody's butt that's on a mass transit system is revenue producing or revenue generating. And the other, especially in a place like Chicago, the other folks that are there generally are students. The L is the lifeblood of Loyola and DePaul University, and we have a strong parochial or private school system in Chicago. And how do you think those kids get to St. Ignatius? How do they get to Fenwick? How do they get to some of our private schools? They take the CTA. So the message is good, but mass transit's clearly, I think, part of the major reason that we have at least one economic success and generator and growth in Illinois, and we ought to sing it from the
I know as you put this together, Chairman, such a good point that Joan Coogan, who was at CTA and now is the first Deputy Chief of Staff for Mayor Emanuel, could help put together some of the data that they get from World Business Chicago and the qualitative data that they also get when they're doing interviews about companies coming in here. And that whole corridor on North Avenue that built up, it's seemingly overnight, but it was a couple decades, which is now, I think, the second largest sales force generator in the city of Chicago after Michigan Avenue. If their surveys of the retail that came in was all about transit, from the Sedgwick stop to the Red Line stop at North Clybourne, because of their employees, not just their customers. And as you know, Apple picked that plaza because they knew that their customers could get off the train and go right into that shop. So,
and if you ever want to believe it, if you want to go look at one stop, go look at, I believe it's the Morgan stop on the Green Line, and just look. Google's right there. It's going to be how McDonald's gets its employees there, but that is an amazing stop. And those of us who grew up around here, when you look at that area, it's mind-boggling to look at that economic growth.
So what I suggest is a bit of a paradigm shift when we think about, because I was supportive of public-private partnerships, we have to have a bit of a shift in terms of where we source some of our revenue and how specific or explicit we are about going to these public or private entities and saying, we'd like you to support transit with something very specific. We tend to get the support from the general public, from taxes that come from citizens who may not see a direct correlation between what transit provides for them and the cost of it. But these businesses, I was thinking that Amazon's opening up a new distribution center in Monique. Well, wouldn't it be interesting to go to them and say, hey, look, if we work something out here where you specifically support PACE in delivering employees from the University Park stop, this might be a win-win situation for both. So to the chairman's point, I think we just have to be more explicit, more specific, and really kind of shift some of the economic burden for transit expenses as well as some of our capital needs to those who directly benefit from that investment.
Okay, our second question, again related to the how do we maintain our strength to the CBD? What would it take to get more people out of their cars and into transit for trips headed downtown? We have incentives for using transit. There's the Transit Benefit Program, Dump the Pump campaigns, and parking buyouts. There are easier, cheaper connections between modes, cheaper and more straightforward downtown shuttles and circulators, or more expensive parking downtown. And finally, giving transit more priority on roads, such as bus lanes and signal priority to improve transit speed and reliability. This is downtown.
What did you mean? What kind of incentives do you have in mind for transit, for using transit?
Well, more like getting along the lines of the Transit Benefit Program, advocating and promoting that. The more the kind of dump the pump campaigns that make people aware of the benefits of using transit. Ride-on campaigns. There's going to be advocate for parking buyouts so that people understand the cost of parking better.
I think of that as more marketing it than incentives.
Yeah. Okay, the downtown circulator. And kind of again seems to be a broad interest in all categories. Any further discussion? Okay, thank you.
Okay, that moves us on to our next headline, number 5, growing markets in suburban Cook could benefit transit. So suburban Cook County is actually growing in both population and employment at a much faster rate than the rest of the region. We looked at growth in several different demographic groups based on age, on race, and on car ownership, and we noticed that there is more growth in several submarkets in suburban Cook County that have a high propensity to use transit, as you can see on this chart. So the demographic groups on the right are more likely to use transit, and those on the left are less likely to use transit. And so these bars show the relative change over the past 10 years. And you can see in some specific groups, such as no car or one car available, African American, low income, and younger adult categories that are all on the right are more likely to use transit, and we're seeing growth in those areas. But it's also interesting to note on the left the category of older adults who are generally less likely to use transit for work, but may become more dependent on transit as they age. So this combination of employment and population growth and the growth in these key demographics really are a notable trend for us to take a look at. This map depicts the planning work that we've conducted through our community planning program to complete transit-oriented development or TOD studies. The majority of our work that we do through that program is in Cook County, which includes much of our implementation work as well. We've worked in Palatine, Des Plaines, Morton Grove, Oak Park, Cicero, Orland Park, and Homewood, as well as several TOD corridor studies along PACE routes on Harlem Avenue, Cicero, and Ridgeland Avenues. And this really just indicates that suburban Cook County communities are willing to take on higher densities, as well as support the ability to own fewer cars by providing mobility options for the residents, as well as transit accessible housing. This brings us to our first question here, and that is, how do we reinforce transit-oriented development in the suburbs? So we can either advocate and educate. This is providing information on the benefits of TOD or how to pursue transit-oriented development to municipalities. Fund planning studies. This is something we're doing already through our community planning program, but perhaps this is something that we want to focus more on or provide more funding towards. Provide implementation assistance. Again, this is something we're doing through our community planning program as well as our access to transit improvement program. But do we want to put more effort into this or more funding? And the fourth is influencing new developments. This would be a new area for us. This gets into actually reviewing development proposals at the municipal level and having some sort of influence on what new developments go in that are near transit, and to make sure that they are supportive and help to build ridership in that area.
So on the provide implementation assistance, I mean, fund planning studies, I understand that. That's come through ICE funds, and we've approved many of those. The provide implementation assistance, I mean, would we be sending guys out with hard hats, or what's the thought there?
So there's different realms. So a lot of what we do already is more policy type implementation. So providing assistance or funding to do a zoning code. To make sure that the zoning actually supports mixed-use development in TOD. Also bringing in developers from the private sector to really give some feedback to municipalities on what they should do to really make themselves a little more open to TOD. But it could also be providing actual capital funding. That's what we do through our Access to Transit Improvement Program. It's a very small bit that we use really to build sidewalks and crosswalks, bike racks, things like that. But maybe we're able to find some more money and get more of those shovels in the ground type projects. Sure.
Point of clarification, don't we already provide fund planning studies often?
We do. So the question here is, do we want to continue doing that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's looking like we want to focus more on providing implementation assistance. Sure.
One question. When I was kind of thinking about the graph you showed before with the subcategories of who used what, and I guess the thing that I was stuck on is, where are they going? That is to say, we talk about who uses transit services, but the question that it almost begs is, so where are they trying to get to? Are they trying to get to work? Are they trying to just move around the area?
Yeah, those are all work trips. Right?
Yeah, I can chime in. Those are all work, for that analysis, those are all work trips. Yeah, specifically.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. We'll move on to our next question. And what types of transit services could better support suburb to suburb travel, so traveling within the suburbs? And the options here are arterial rapid transit, ART service, or express bus service that we're seeing PACE provide through their Pulse service or through the I-90 and I-55 express services. More traditional bus service. This is the typical service that PACE provides in communities. Or local on-demand service that could be dial rides or call-in rides. Or van pools. This is where PACE actually offers the vehicles for workers to carpool together to work. Or private partnerships for direct services. So this could mean bike and car share, particularly for the last mile, employer provided shuttles, Zipcar, Divvy, Uber, Lyft, those types of services. well, it looks like leaning towards private partnerships or direct services, but also looking at ART and express bus services. Any questions or comments on that?
All right, well, we'll keep on our flyby throughout the region, and now we'll talk about the south side of Chicago and the south suburbs. So here we think more jobs and new connections are needed. The south side of Chicago has pretty good transit access right now. There are several CTA and Metro rail lines that run through it. There are also many CTA and PACE buses that run through it. However, we find that Southsiders' commutes are the longest in the region. They're long for all modes, which are shown in this map on orange, but they're especially long for people taking transit. And there are a couple reasons for this. Part of it is that many people living in the south side of Chicago in particular are working in industrial jobs and manufacturing jobs that are not located in the loop where the best transit connections goes. And part of it is that there aren't many jobs located in these parts of the region. So people just have to go further to get to work. There's also a lot of vacancy in the south side of Chicago, as you can see from this map from the Cook County Land Bank Authority. So we're seeing this area with very good transit access, but very high vacancy and long travel times. And we know that there are a lot of things going on in the south and the west sides, more than just the transit service. But we know that the ability to get to jobs in a reasonable amount of time is very important. And so we wanted to ask you two questions about that today. The first one is, how can we as transit agencies help to support economic growth on the south side? And this is really about bringing more jobs into those areas, because that's the best way to get short commutes for people, is to bring the jobs to them. In this case, we could take a very active role in developing land around the stations. We, as the agencies, might buy parcels and combine them into parcels that are appealing to developers. We might take more of an educational role, where we're really promoting those areas to developers and working alongside those who are already trying to invite development, and just make sure that they know the value that the transit connectivity provides. Shifting focus, we could support on more transit employment programs, and this would be more about bringing people on the south and west side into transit careers by doing more local recruiting or partnering with community colleges, as PACE does now, or increasing use of things like CTA's Second Chance program. Or we could focus really on the core of what we as transit agencies do, which is to improve the transit connections themselves.
Would the support transit employment programs include supplier diversity programs, where you might employ diverse suppliers who would tend to hire people from that area that might be a more localized workforce? Would that be something that could be envisioned in that particular description, or no?
It could be. That's an interesting idea.
It should be.
Supplier diversity, perhaps, yeah.
So if you say that it will be, then I'll vote for that.
It will be, yeah. That's a good point. So it looks like most folks are kind of leaning toward having us focus on our core, which is transit connections, with maybe a little bit of work in the transit employment periods and promoting the area to developers. Not so much for us on the active land development area, which is fine. So speaking of those transit connections, our next question is actually about that, which is, how do we improve the transit connections? So this then is thinking about how to get people to the jobs wherever they are, recognizing that there's already pretty good transit service to the loop. So we could look at restructuring bus services. This might just be looking at what we have there and what it connects to. This could be adding more workplace express services. Both CTA and PACE already provide such services to some of the suburban areas and out to Schaumburg, directly from the south suburbs and from the south side. We could look at Metro and CTA fare integration in the city. And this would look at making those more cost comparable for folks using those services and transferring between them. We could look at upgrading existing rail services. This might be improving some of the Metro stations or adding service on the Metro Electric. Or should we support rail extensions like what CTA is doing with the Red Line South extension? Now, ideally, we would do all of these things, but they all cost resources, and so we're really asking for you to give us some feedback on which two you think are areas that we should really focus on. Looks like we've got kind of a mix coming in. A lot of emphasis on those workplace express services and on maybe some fare integration and looking at that. Anybody have any thoughts or want to talk about any of these things? Ideas? Thank you.
Okay, so headline number 7, more capacity is needed on Chicago's north side. Population density remains strong on Chicago's north and northwest sides. This map shows high concentrations of population in the dark green color along the CTA red, brown, and blue lines, as well as Metro's north and northwest rail lines. You can see that pop of that dark green on the north side there. Employment density is also very strong on Chicago's north side. And here we see strong employment along the CTA red line, approaching the level of density that is seen in areas near the Chicago CBD. So you can see that going up there right on the lakefront and following the red line going north there, that dark concentration of that color there. So with both high population and employment, transit use on Chicago's north side is higher than any other corridor in our region. This map shows the percentage of commutes that are made using public transit, and you can see that dark green again, illustrating the intense mode share on Chicago's north side, particularly again along that red line lakefront corridor, where as high as 65% of commutes are made on transit. This level of transit is of course encouraging, but it can contribute to some capacity issues on our service. We don't necessarily have more room for people on some of our existing services, or room to even add more service. So that brings us to our question here, and what is needed to support further transit growth on the north side? First is increased capacity on the existing services, both bus and rail. Improved transit infrastructure to help improve speed, comfort, and amenities to passengers. Prioritize buses on roadways for faster, more reliable bus service, or adding new routes and services. Well, it's looking like focus on increased capacity on existing services or improving transit infrastructure. Any comments or questions on this one?
Just one, and I have not looked at, and today is the first look at President Trump's initial budget plans. I know I heard on the radio he whacked Amtrak real hard, but when we were out there at the APTA meeting, one of the things they said, and it's a pool of money, the president, it's like Springfield, only has, he has very little discretionary spending, most of it's entitlements. So one of the areas of discretionary spending he has is the pool of money that funds core capacity issues. So I just warn you that that's one of the places where the president has very little flexibility that he can find funds. And we have been very successful with our congressional delegation at getting core capacity money, and we'll find out, I think, by the end of the day, if we haven't already, that core capacity is going to be harder to go after than in the future.
So the proposal presented today, actually, the president proposed cutting it completely.
Pretty good guess, huh?
But Chicago got its full funding grant agreement under the last administration, so the theory being that we're good for a while. I guess we'll get those monies.
What does a while mean? Good for a while?
Well, because we got the red line, the city and CTA and the red line got their full funding grant agreement, so that those funds are committed.
Right.
But
still, this poll's about future.
That's sort of separate to this, but I mean, just to clarify that he did propose cutting the capital investment grant program. That's the president's proposal.
Right.
Congress is the one that actually acts.
So once we see what Congress does, we should re-vote on this if that goes.
Right. My guess is the president would tell the mayor of Philadelphia or New York, who obviously have core capacity issues as well. He'll wink at him and say, when I do my big infrastructure plan, that we'll backfill some of that, and hopefully that'll be reality as well. but I just know he's got very little ability to find monies to increase defense spending like he wants to, and core capacity just happens to be something he can actually cut, like public radio and TV and the other stuff that he did today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the eighth of our 9 headlines is that large suburban job clusters are difficult to serve by traditional transit. A substantial amount of employment exists in suburban areas throughout the region, of course. Recall the population density and housing closely follow the metro rail lines from this kind of historic growth of towns along the railroads. However, major employment clusters in the suburbs, as shown here, are more dispersed and strongly influenced by more recent build-outs of the expressway and tollway systems and the influence of O'Hare Airport. So our question on this topic is, what can agencies do to shape land use and mobility in the commercial areas? Again, provide assistance for the TOD, the planning and implementation we talked about earlier, or partner directly with employers to provide pedestrian infrastructure, reduce the sea of parking, enable van pool programs and transit incentives, continue the push for shuttles, that is serving the reverse commute from metro stations to employment centers, or adopt apps and technology innovations to make local service more effective, or leave it to the locals and the private firms to kind of sort it out themselves. That would innovations in like call and ride to make it more Uber-like and
Some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, actually.
more transit information and real-time information.
Leanne, I saw some folks from DuPage County walk in a minute ago, but the continued push for shuttles, was there a shuttle that they had out in Downers Grove that just never materialized and they shut it down?
That was one of our pilot projects. We work with Pace and Metra, and there was the Esplanade development, Hamilton Partners. We set a target for ridership. That route never got to that ridership level. The Pace board is now considering whether it should be discontinued. So it's kind of unknown exactly what the future of that is.
So like how many people a day would do that?
We were looking to get 60 rides, so like 30 people making a round trip. We were only ever getting, I average out about 35 trips, so 15, 20 people a day. Okay, so apps and make things better, more user-friendly, and kind of the other options are of interest.
I thought partnering with employers was important because you can understand their multi-year resource strategies. Where are they recruiting from? Are they trying to get millennials to come out there? And then you could get access to their employee base through them on how do you come and go to work? What would change your mind or attitude or influence you to take public transportation, and really not guess, because you would have that access to both their strategies and their employee base, because otherwise you're kind of guessing and going off of probably data that was yesterday, and they're looking ahead, and big employers do that really well.
We found that in these efforts for the
big
shuttles,
placement firms.
Yeah, that the employers they're using these for recruiting, and the fact that their current employment base may not actually use transit, but people that are applying for jobs see this as an opportunity. Okay.
All right, sounds good. So we are at the final headline. Headline number 9, Millennials and Boomers push transit to adapt. So there's a lot of discussion about millennials and boomers. There's also a lot of discussion about the mobility ecosystem and how this will change transit. The verdict is still out on the impact of mobility changes, but we are seeing changes amongst these demographic groups that we think will significantly impact transit into the future. This map depicts the percentage change in population for the millennial group ages 20 to 34, and you can see the highest relative growth is shown in orange here. The story is not just about the city, but it's also about the suburbs, where millennials are likely to move in the coming years and already are. The question for us is, how do we keep millennials on transit as they move? This map depicts the percentage change in population for baby boomers, or adults aged 65 and older. The region is aging, with an overall increase of 7% in the population over 65, but primarily in the suburbs and the collar counties in the Chicago Central Business District, as you can see again in orange here. This is anticipated to cause an increase in demand for ADA complementary service and local paratransit, which will also increase the cost of these services. The likely increase in paratransit demand and costs can be addressed through changes by the way we currently deliver services, but also raises questions about how to better serve these areas through technology and mobility services, or the TNCs, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. Most boomers are more tech savvy than older generations, and early research indicates that they're more willing to try new ways of getting around. So our question here is, how can we adapt to the changing mobility market, including private mobility services? Recognizing that companies and new options are out there, and we need to decide how to respond as transit agencies. So our responses here are: offer data for app development. In this option, we could make more of our data available to the private sector so that we can create apps and make operational decisions to better integrate with public transportation services. Pilots and partnerships with private services for last mile connectivity and alternate service delivery. We could protect the right-of-way for transit and highest occupancy modes in the event that new mobility increases highway congestion. Or we can adapt and implement best practices from private sector for on-demand and flexible services, or in other words, we could do it ourselves. So we had a lot of conversation earlier about this topic, so curious in people's responses.
Director Higgins gets a weighted vote here.
So, Jill, I know you do this, but part of what I think is implicit in that is that you ask these groups what they might want and incorporate that into these choices. Is that not a correct statement? That as you survey, I mean, off of Sarah's question, you actually go to the user group, the potential market, both those who are using services as well as those who are not using services, and ask them what would they like to see before you make a recommendation. Is that a correct statement?
Are you speaking like for our kind of last mile, like our shuttle bug?
Well, the question about how can we adopt the change in mobility market, including private mobility services, to appeal to millennials and boomers, I think that's the complete question, right?
Right.
So I'm saying we should probably ask the boomers and
I see what you're saying. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, we're starting with you.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
but yeah, not in. Oh, I stepped in it there. You as the RTA board, I should be more specific. As a millennial.
As I sit here now, I can kind of see where I think this needs to go. It needs to be integrated app-like experience, but I don't yet have a predisposition as to whether or not that should be with our data, our services provided every level of the way, or if it's a public-private partnership in the way of number two. So it seems to me that should be perhaps something that's studied and options developed, bidding process. I don't know what it would look like, but I'm not sure between the first two. I have an open mind on that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's why we're asking this question. This is obviously an important topic and one that needs to evolve. So there's some things that we do well and some things that the private market does well. And I guess in general, we just think we need to work that out a lot better.
I want to make sure we don't give them data that lets them, this is the private sector, that lets them figure out how to cannibalize us, because they're very creative. And if you give them this data, they're going to sit there and say, how do we put public transportation out of business? So you're going to have to be really careful when we say offer our data for app development, what they can and cannot get under law.
Well, no, we mean data more in the terms of the operations of the service, so buses and trains and next time, real-time predictability, location services, things like that, not our ridership data per se. We mean more
I-
to create those apps that people could use to write nests.
I saw it as the reverse, to talk to them about public-private partnerships. I mean, their drivers are not making money, so it is not necessarily under attack for how they're being paid and the assertions about the amount of money you could actually make as a driver. So they're going to be looking for how to use their app developers, their tech folks, how to make money. And instead of offering our data, say, we're offering to partner with you to brainstorm how we could actually serve a city like Chicago using your data and using your technology platforms. So I saw it kind of reverse. And you're never going to catch up with their data. I think they probably have everything that we have now, is my guess.
And more.
And more.
I mean, they're tracking us every minute. Uber's tracking me, knows where I'm at every
Through your
point.
blender, even.
Yeah. Microwave.
All right. And
Okay.
just one comment, and this is especially for those of you from the city. A very prominent alderman called me, and we had breakfast a couple of weeks ago, and he was complaining that he said, he goes, Uber has significantly slowed down. It's the 151, I guess, that rides up and down Michigan Avenue, and has really slowed down. You guys are in the business of moving people as quickly as possible. Uber really slows your buses down because it's where they drop off and they're pulling U-turns on Michigan Avenue. He goes, they really create a congestion problem, which, makes your buses a lot slower. And I've been on the 151 and 156, and our bus drivers are, they go ballistic at some of the Uber people who literally block their path, including stopping right by our station so they can't pull up to pick up 8 people that are waiting there in cold weather or rainy weather. So Uber is it's an issue out there in terms of our bus speed too.
Chairman, that's a very good point. I'll just note that no one responded to or protect right away for transit, and that's what that intended, meaning bus-only lanes and things like that. So I just think it's something that we should consider.
Right. I mean, one of the things that APTA they talked about was, on a stretch of Michigan Avenue, like you do at the United Center or O'Hare, do you force all the Ubers to drop off in one place and pick up in one place and not do door-to-door service?
Okay, let's move on to the next question here. So somewhat related, how do we prepare our transit system for technological advances in the future? By this, we are now focusing on technology specific to the transit sector, the use of big data for operations, connected vehicles, more intelligent transportation systems linking highway and transit operations as examples. So we could set aside funding for technology, we could encourage and host pilots, or we can monitor what's happening and evaluate what action is needed once the market is more proven. Okay. Looks like most of the votes in pretty resounding for being proactive, I would say, and setting aside funding for technology. So it's a good feedback. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to move on to our last question for today. What are specific opportunities to improve ADA paratransit and local dial-a-ride services? These services fill an important mobility gap for older adults and people with disabilities, but are also some of our most complicated services to operate. So with this, we could engage in more partnerships with private mobility services. We could work with locals to encourage more sustainable funding for these services. We can promote fixed route first, recognizing that there are always challenges with the pedestrian environment. Or we can evaluate and adapt current services to take advantage of new technology and operating methods. So it looks like the leader on this is just barely working with the locals, recognizing that it is a local issue and kind of a regional component in that, and then promoting fixed route first, trying to get as many riders as we possibly can on that service, and then engaging in more partnerships. So thank you. So with that, we've reached the end. Thank you for all of your feedback and your patience going through this. A lot of great discussion. That was very helpful. We tried to categorize these in 9 headlines. I'm sure there's some things that we missed. So our team is open to any other feedback that people have on what you think is important and what we should discuss. From here, our next steps are we're going to have a stakeholder meeting in May to get more feedback, perhaps using a similar presentation that we have here to kind of get input. We'll also be partnering, as I said earlier, with CMAP. They're having with their long-range comprehensive plan, having a lot of public outreach. So we're going to work with them to reach out to the public on there. Then our plan is to come back to you at the end of the summer with kind of a more defined, here's what we heard and here's what our thoughts are moving forward and what will actually shape the strategic plan. So thank you. Open to any other questions.
Two things if I could do.
Yep.
You know, with the ADA, one of the things is the last mile. So I can understand promoting fixed route, but it's getting to those stops.
Yep.
So I think if you really want to look at ADA, that's where you need to look at is that getting to the stop is the key. And then secondly, when I looked at the partnership thing, I was thinking more of Divvy bikes as opposed to Uber and stuff like that. So I think as we look into the intercity, especially, you know, I noticed on the west side even some Divvy bikes, and they're actually still there. So it's a good thing. But I think that's another option. Otherwise, it's weather conditioned, you know, obviously because of the snow and stuff. But I think a partnership with them, with the millennials, would be a way to look at it too. I didn't look at it as the Uber or whatever. I looked at more of that. So those are my comments.
Yeah.
And I would take a similar kind of survey to some of the downtown organizations, Chicago Loop Alliance, BOMA, et cetera. And, you know, a lot of companies like where I work, we actually moved across the loop on a headquarters that was well-known, fully paid for over 30 years, and are building a new headquarters by the train stations because the majority of our employees and the look to the future were coming in on those stations. So.
Thank you. That's good. We'll reach out to them.
2 quick points. One, and I know we already do this, but make sure we harmonize with any other plans that are being put together, like the county's putting together a plan, Northwest Indiana. Make sure we harmonize them. If somebody else is doing it and it can help us, then let them do it and we just blend it into what we do. So I just want to emphasize that. And the second thing, this is kind of like an outside point, but I just keep thinking like there's maybe lessons learned. That we look and mark ourselves against domestic competition, but like in Japan and other places, whatever best practices we might learn and basically incorporate some of those into our system might be beneficial. So Japan and Europe are much more integrated in public transportation. And to the extent we can find something there that might be a pearl or a nugget for us to incorporate in our plan, we should do that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I would like to, I'd like to compliment the staff. Your preparation of these materials I thought was outstanding, and incorporating the technology into the presentation was just a great idea. I worked in education all my life, and we were always trying to find ways to do strategic planning. I thought you did a great job here.
I could not agree more. It was very structured, and I still think you created some conversations that we could even follow up on. I was very, very impressed with with the way you did this.
Good.
All
Thank
of you.
Thanks to the team.
Yeah, thank these guys.
Yeah.
See, they say thank you to transit workers.
Thank you. We got to give our cards.
Oh, I love it. Thank you. It was outstanding. So with that, I need a motion and a second to adjourn. Director Trione moves we adjourn, seconded by Director Michael Lewis. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, and thanks to the staff.